Okay, so this is my slideshow lecture on Louis XIV. Our topic in Unit 3 right now is absolutism. And so the word absolutism, by looking at it, we see the root absolute, the idea of all encompassing. And so what we see happening in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western Europe and in Russia is a development in the power of the monarchs. Now, it's important to point out, I think, that when we say absolute, what we're doing is we're talking about the traditional powers of the monarch: law and enacting law, enforcing law, taxation, and also policies on religion. Okay, and the fourth would be uh, waging war, declaring wars. Okay, so these are the traditional powers of the monarchs. And what we find in this period of what we call absolutism is a development in the connection between the sovereignty of the state, the identity of the state, with the monarch. And so in this slideshow, I'm going to focus on France and Louis XIV. And in my other slideshow, I will focus on Peter the Great of Russia. Okay. And then next week in class, we'll be talking about the absolute monarchs of Austria and Prussia. Okay. But this one's Louis XIV, and he's probably the best monarch to start with, excuse me, for that example of absolutism. Okay. So let's go on to our next slide here. A little bit of background. Louis was of the House of Bourbon, and the name Louis actually comes from one of the first kings of France. Was back in the period we call the Dark Ages, and in the Frankish kingdom. Before it was France, it was the Frankish kingdom, and his name was Clovis. And so Louis is an adaptation of Clovis. And that's why traditionally there have been so many kings of France named Louis, because it's basically an acknowledgement of that connection with Clovis, the first king. So Louis was of the House of Bourbon, the dynasty of the Bourbon family, sometimes called Louis the Great or the Sun King. And that name of the Sun King is a funny story. It comes from when Louis was a young boy. He was performing in a pageant, and he was portraying the character of the sun. And so he was dressed in this dazzling array. But so the nickname of the Sun King stuck with him. But what's interesting is that he was also called the Sun King because like the sun, everything revolved around Louis. Everything orbited around Louis. He was literally the center of French society, French government, and French identity. Often referred to as one of the grand monarchs, that Louis, as a grand monarch, embodied every quality of absolutism. He reigned for 72 years and was one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history until a few years ago when he was knocked out of that position. He and Victoria of England were knocked out of that position by Elizabeth II. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, how did Louis embody the qualities of absolutism? Well, one, let's look at some of his political scheming. Now, keep in mind that one of the qualities of absolutism is the efforts on the part of the monarch to manipulate or to alter the balance of power in Europe, to create favorable positions for their nation states. So, one thing that Louis accomplished was to push the borders of France eastward to the Rhine River. Now, the Rhine River runs through Western and Central Europe, and carries a great deal of trade and commerce along it. But it also forms, the Rhine also forms the natural boundary of several countries. So Louis, in his waging wars, pushed the borders of France eastward to the Rhine. Now, I'm going to talk about Louis's wars a little bit later, but let's talk about, again, his political maneuvering, right? He married the sister of King Charles II, the King of Spain, in an effort to secure not only the throne of France, of which he was the king, but also the throne of Spain. And Louis used marriage in an effort to secure this. Note when we talk about the War of Spanish Succession, that will also be one of them. The War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century was Louis's efforts to secure the throne of Spain for his grandson, which would essentially combine the thrones of Spain and France into what they called joint monarchy. But we'll talk more about that later. Louis was determined to be the sole ruler of France. Now, by that, I don't mean just like one king. You know, obviously, you can only have one ruler. But when I say the sole ruler of France, is what I mean that literally in Louis's mind, he was France. Louis, in his mind, embodied France, and not just by being French, but by being the king of France. Literally, France was embodied within him. He was not the first ruler to think this way. I mean, Queen Elizabeth I of England, she certainly embodied the qualities of the English. You know, in fact, she went so far as to say that she married England. That England was her husband, right? You know, so it's not uncommon for a monarch to think of him or herself as the embodiment of the state. But Louis took it to an extreme. And so we saw that quote the other day in class, l'état c'est moi, je suis l'état c'est moi. I am the state. I am the state. The state is I am France, you know. And one of his other policies was one king, one law, one faith. And so, remember that Louis's efforts were to consolidate power, to centralize power within himself. So one king, one law, and one faith. His finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis employed Colbert in an effort to regain control of the tax system throughout France. It's a funny story is that obviously the more taxes a monarch can collect, the more money is in the government for him to spend on warfare, right? You know, wars are expensive, and so Louis needed taxes. Well, the problem was that a lot of the local towns and cities throughout France were not paying their fair share of taxes. They were actually keeping some back. They were actually keeping a lot back. And so Louis appointed a brilliant finance minister by the name of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who used basically threats and intimidation to force the towns to pay their fair shares of taxes, and thus that allowed Louis to wage more wars. Let's go to our next. Let's talk about Louis, religion, and the nobility. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, thereby undoing the actions of his grandfather, Henry IV. Now, if you remember, it was Henry who extended legal status to the Huguenots, those French Calvinists. And if you remember, the Huguenots were primarily from what social class? They were from the nobility, right? They were from the nobility. And so when Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, it was not just a religious move, it was political, because Louis was exerting a bit more control over the nobility, okay? Cardinal Mazarin and Bishop Brosset both shaped Louis's Catholicism. Louis was a devout Catholic, and these two men were influential, extremely influential in shaping his notions of Catholicism. Louis XIV's major power struggles were with two groups. One, the nobility. And if you recall, the Fronde, which occurred earlier in Louis's reign, involved an uprising and an attempt by the nobility to assert control over the young Louis. And it forever shaped his notions and his views of the nobility. His other struggle was with the parlements, or the regional local governing councils. Louis exerted a great deal of control over the parlements. And think of them as like a local government, a local council that would administer like town business and that kind of thing, or hear court cases, right? So sometimes court cases would be heard by the parlements, but Louis attempted to exert more control over them and to limit their influence, actually. Louis exerted a great deal of control over the nobility by manipulating them. And he did this through favoritism. One of the interesting things with Louis is that the nobles found it that sometimes they would be in favor with Louis and sometimes out of favor. And so the nobles really began to make efforts to be in Louis's good favor. Because that would pay off politically for them later. They would be able to ask the king for favors and so forth. And so Louis was brilliant in playing the nobles against each other. By that, what I mean is that he would deliberately kind of break off contact with the nobles, and that would get them thinking, oh my God, what did I do to upset the king? Why is he not inviting me to Versailles for the weekend? Why is he not inviting me to banquets and so forth? And then suddenly the nobles would find themselves back in Louis's good graces. And so the nobility never really knew, were they in with Louis or were they out with Louis? And this was a very flagrant manipulation of this favored status, right? And also Louis would sometimes withhold privileges to the nobility, and then he would grant them again, then he would take them back, and so forth. And then one of the major events was when Louis ordered the construction of the palace at Versailles, which is outside of Paris. And Louis basically located and centralized the government functioning at Versailles. And so this way, Louis was able to keep everybody within his immediate circle, within his immediate presence at the palace. And it was quite an honor. If you were a noble, it was quite an honor to be invited to Versailles. And so many of the nobles would actually kind of plot against each other. So in order to get an invitation to Versailles. So when you think about it, Louis was brilliant with this because, look, he had the nobility working against the nobility. The very thing. It's like, what's that phrase? Is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so think about it. If Louis was in a power struggle with the nobility, what better way to deal with the nobility than to play them against each other? And so the Palace of Versailles and its role as a focal point for Louis's royal court was just brilliant. Let's go on to our next slide. Let's talk about Louis and the arts. This is often overlooked, and it's unfortunate because the role that monarchs play in promoting the arts is very important. If you recall, in our last unit, in Unit 2, we talked about how during the scientific revolution, many of the monarchs of Western Europe were promoting scientific advances through the establishment of what they called royal societies. So we talked about that in Unit 2. Well, it was also through the promotion of the arts that monarchs could exert their influence nationally as well. And so let's look, for instance, at Louis. Louis promoted French opera, okay? Louis promoted French opera and French music, Baroque music, okay? One of the most prominent was his promotion of Jean-Baptiste Lully, whose music is especially beautiful and adapted to the ballet. Okay, a lot of the compositions that Jean-Baptiste Lully created were meant for ballet, and it's ballet that really Louis exceeded many of the monarchs of Western Europe. Louis promoted ballet in the style of what they considered spectacle. Now, when we hear the word spectacle, when we think something was a spectacle, we think it's bad, right? It's like, oh my God, it was an awful spectacle. But in the 17th century, the word spectacle meant grand and just extravagant. Okay, so don't think of spectacle as a negative thing like we do today. Instead, think of the word spectacle as it was back then. And that was, spectacle was this brilliant, brilliant, grand show. And it was almost like accentuating Louis when you think about it. Not that Louis performed in these, but because Louis promoted French Baroque music and French opera and the ballet, that it reinforced Louis' status and stature, right? Louis also endorsed the opening of the Comédie Française in Paris, which is still going, by the way. You can still see shows at the Comédie Française in Paris. And the founder of the Comédie Française was a playwright by the name of Molière. And he authored many of the plays that were performed there. Molière died on stage at the Comédie Française. He was performing in one of his own plays, actually, and he died on stage. So Molière, we'll look at a little bit of his work next week if we get the time. But suffice it to say that Louis was the one who endorsed the founding of the Comédie Française, and he actually promoted Molière's plays. Okay, let's go to our next slide, our last slide actually, and let's look at the major opposition that Louis XIV faced in his reign. Okay, so if you recall, the Dutch, excuse me, if you recall, the Dutch, in their revolt against Spanish domination, anything like that in Europe would tip the balance of power in terms of the nation states of Western Europe. So when the Dutch revolted against the Spanish, it altered the balance of power, and Louis actually attempted to establish domination over the Dutch. And so the Dutch, in response, tried to balance power against France. Now, if you recall, one of the names that we saw back with the Dutch revolt against the Spanish in Unit 2 was William of Orange. Now, that William of Orange was William the First, okay? That was William the First, William of Orange. Now we have another William of Orange. But don't get confused. This one is William the Third, okay? This is William the Third of Orange. So there are actually several Williams of Orange, and it always is important. We want to keep the numbers straight, right? And so this is not William the First of Orange, who was assassinated, in his home. But this is rather William the Third of Orange, okay? One of the other major forms of opposition was when Louis fought the War of Spanish Succession. In his attempt to gain the throne of Spain for his grandson. And so in this, Louis faced various alliances, what they called the Grand Alliances, or the First Alliance, the Second Alliance, and so on. And these alliances were formed by various countries and nation states of Western Europe. England, for instance, joined with the Netherlands and Austria in an attempt to maintain the balance of power, and they fought against Louis. And so Louis was always facing these grand alliances that formed in an effort to fight against him and to prevent the balance of power tipping toward domination by France. And so this concludes my overview of Louis XIV in our Palmer material and in relation to that notion of absolutism. I'll, in a moment, the other slideshow you can watch is mine on Peter the Great of Russia. Both great examples of this absolutist ideal.